Intersectionality. The future just may hang on it. Find out how and why when Professor Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw, who coined the term, joins me in studio. And later, meet survivors of police violence and learn how they're finding ways to build power from all that pain. And a few words from me on movement making over the centuries. Welcome to the Laura Flanders Show, the place where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the ones who are doing it. Intersectionality. You'll find the word everywhere, from People magazine to the signs carried by marchers on the Women's March on Washington this year. It comes from a paper by the law professor Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw, published over 25 years ago in a legal journal. She used it then to describe the intersecting effects of racism and sexism on African American women. Like a car in an intersection, Black women get hit from multiple directions. Today, intersectionality's become a rallying cry. The New York Times called it, quote, the main point of rhetorical resistance against single-issue feminism. And it is quite possibly the concept that will catapult the struggle for justice in the US and globally into a new chapter, or not. Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw is a tenured professor at Columbia and UCLA law schools and the founder and director of the African American Policy Forum. She's also my friend. Hi, Kim. Welcome back to the program.
Laura.
So just to start, you were described in the New York Times, an article by Amanda Hess, as the leading thinker around this question of intersectionality, and that question being the leading concept transforming our understanding of race, gender, social justice, and movement building. Must have felt pretty good, didn't it?
Well, you know, it's an interesting time now because, as you point out, the word intersectionality is on everyone's lips. So that's amazing. And at the same time, the way people are using intersectionality is, let's say, varied at best.
So give us some examples.
Well, so there's some visions of intersectionality that just portray it as it's complicated. It's sort of the, well, it's intersectional, So basically it means no one explanation tells you everything you need to know. But a lot of times that's just the end of the conversation. I think the second thing that I've seen is the idea that intersectionality is basically identity politics on steroids. So first you have the negativity associated with addressing the politics of identity being reduced to a term, identity politics, that now functions kind of like political correctness. It's the thing that you don't want to be. And then you throw intersectionality in it, so it takes everything that's bad about identity politics and then, complicates it by a factor of 1,000. Those aren't really the most productive ways of thinking about intersectionality at the moment.
What did you make of the way that the March on Washington handled some of these questions?
It was, again, another complicated moment because on one hand, it was important that a women's march actually show the connections between issues that face women as a group and issues around which women have specific kind of ways of experiencing it, but it's not traditionally seen as a women's issue, like immigration, for example. Not traditionally seen as a women's issue, but immigrant women who are undocumented have a whole range of risks and vulnerabilities associated being with a woman who's undocumented. So it was important to be able to address those kinds of issues at a moment when the actual frame was about women. So I thought that was great. But then there are other moments when I think folks kind of thought intersectionality was just about who's standing up there, not necessarily what they're saying. So you can be a woman of color, or you can be a queer woman and not necessarily have an intersectional analysis.
We have noticed that.
And you can be a white woman or a man of color and have an intersectional analysis. So it's one of the reasons why I stay away from the idea of you can tell if a movement or organization is intersectional just based on who's leading it. That's not always the case.
Big question, but if you were organizing, I don't know, a march tomorrow, how would you tweak it? What would you do?
Well, one of the things that I would do as I look at the different issues is think about how intersectionality shapes the issue, not who are we going to get to come and talk about it. So one of the campaigns that I've been involved in is the Say Her Name campaign. We've been trying to draw attention to women, Black women who have been victims of police violence. Say Her Name showed up at the march, but not in a particularly broadened way that one would expect. So mothers of the movement were there. That was an important thing to make sure that we understand that state violence is of significance to women. So that was important. But the mothers of women who were killed by the police were marching with us. And they weren't really speaking or featured. So what do we make of that? Number one, it was important to have all the ways that women are impacted by state violence, and so that was a step. But a further step is to think about how is state violence impacting women who are actually victims of state violence. So it's basically just closing, or I would say opening the vision so we don't have holes in how the issue is presented.
You just released a report that is a transcript of an extraordinary webinar that you hosted in the days after the election of last November. And you brought together 16 social justice experts. It's called Social Justice SOS. I encourage everybody who's watching, listening to this to check it out. The learning that your webinar afforded all of us was around exactly those issues. How do we understand, if we intersectional better, we would have understood how the votes happened. We would have understood how the issues were resonating or not in the media. We would have been able to anticipate white women's votes, for example, because it has to do with patriarchy more than the womenness of those voters. Talk a little bit about what that report models, if you will, if you think about it that way.
Well, and you know, I woke up the day after the election in a daze, like many people did, and immediately started thinking, while we're in this moment, we need to be able to have a conversation about how we got here from all the different vantage points. So I called up people like Robin Kelly and Alicia Garza and Eve Ensler, Dennis Parker, Tim Wise, Devin Carbado, just some of the smartest people who represent a whole range of issues, from immigration to racism to police misconduct to voting, to actually come together and talk about what had happened. And it was an amazing conversation. I think we were able to move from, you know, moments in history when something like this has happened before, and I think we got a sense of what this could mean for the future. We were able to talk about various constituencies. We were able to talk about how a non-intersectional framing of class contributed to this moment. So the report is basically lifting up some of the most significant moments in the conversation, but I think also in reading the report, you get a model of what it looks like to think about this moment in terms of an intersectional framework.
So the class bit of it, for example?
Well, so, you know, the most common frame now that you hear is this election was about class, not about race. This election was about losses suffered by the working class. Well, of course, if class was the same set of experience across all different groups, you wouldn't have had such a split between white men and black women. When we're talking about class, there's a class division right there. Obviously, what's happening is people are framing class in a singular biographic frame, basically white men. And they're not taking into account, in fact, even the effects that people are saying contributed to this are far more significant in the lives of Black women and the lives of people of color, loss of economic security, all of the things that people say contributed to it actually were happening among the people who voted the most against Trump.
Why do Black women vote the way they do?
Well, so that's part of that's a class issue, it's a race issue, it's a gender issue. There's an awareness of vulnerability coming not just from a lost expectation. This is something that Tim Wise talked about. It's not just loss, it's loss against a backdrop of expectation. So he talked about white nationalism having created a set of expectations about what is supposed to happen to me and what is not supposed to happen to me. And when certain things start happening that go against that grain, Luke Harris calls it diminished overrepresentation. You think you're supposed to have 100%, turns out you only have 90%. So that leads to the resentment, the anger, the righteous indignation. You have other people like Black women. The expectation is always forward-looking. It's always, how's my life going to get better? It's not, this wasn't supposed to happen to me. So I think they just came into it with a very different set of expectations that then played out differently in the ballot box. That's the kind of thing that an intersectional analysis brings to the table.
Project yourself into the future, 50 years. Mm-hmm. How will the history of this moment get written, do you think?
Mm-hmm. I see two possibilities. The one possibility is the way we think back on the election of 1876. Election of 1876 was the backlash election against the first Reconstruction. It was the election that decided the future of African Americans for 7 decades. It was the election that led to the abandonment of the newly freed slaves. It led to the destruction of early efforts to create a public education system. It led to the disenfranchisement of millions of African Americans. It led to the fact that the first Black senator that we had after that moment didn't happen until the 21st century. I mean, that's the kind of thing that can happen, a complete unraveling of the basic infrastructure of civil rights. So we could look back with that lens at this moment and say, it's not just the fact that Trump got elected. It's also the democratic response, the response of civil society, the response of media that tells itself that the reason why this happened was because we've been too deeply associated with social justice. And so the whole idea is that we have to move back to the right to retake the white voter. So it could be a history like that. I don't want that to be the history, right? So I say that one to say, let's try to tell this story. Let's tell a story of it was finally recognized that our inability to talk directly and persuasively about the expectations that have been generated by a history of white supremacy, of class domination, of patriarchy, led us to a moment where we were easily divided. And so we know we can't do that again. So anything that feels like it's going back in the direction that we came from is obviously not the thing to do right now. So just number one, not that thing anymore. Number two, so now we know we need to have better ways of talking across movements. We need to have better ways of determining how to represent certain issues. We need better ways of building movement infrastructures that actually ask, how do we connect up? So I want to say that in 50 years, this was the wake-up call. This was the moment when we recognize that actually we do have a greater constituency than we think. We just now need to figure out how to be far more strategic and visionary about mobilizing these resources, mobilizing this energy. And we need to have expertise to help us do the jobs that we need to do to build the connections that are necessary. It's not just a word.
So that's the positive scenario. I want to end there, but I do just have to ask you about the other. There have been so many pitfalls that we've fallen into as a people over the centuries, and one of them has been divide and conquer. If, for example, I don't know, Donald Trump decides white men need a program, like My Brother's Keeper, only for white males, what do we do? And what about those white women who will say, yes, that is a good way to use public funding?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we have got to be able to have a language that points in the direction of the problem, not the representation or the person, right? That's actually the problem with the existing My Brother's Keeper, program. It's not a program that is based on problems created by sexism, the problems created by white supremacy, the problems created by neoliberalism, the problems created by withdrawing public resources from all public institutions. Instead, it creates this narrative that this particular person needs help. And so our failure to be able to challenge that makes it that much more difficult for us to challenge the versions of it that could well come out of a Trump administration. I think that being able to be far more literate on what actually the social conditions are across race and across class, with an awareness of the ways that race and class exacerbate some of these issues, gives us a platform to say, well, now let's really look at what are all of the ways that working women are not going to be served by this. What are all the ways that non-working people are going to not be served by this? What are the ways that moving in this direction actually recreates that expectation that the way certain members of our population are experiencing a crisis is all that we need to be concerned about, and everyone else is in a position to receive trickle-down social justice. We know trickle-down social justice doesn't work, and in case we need some examples, here they are from history.
Thanks so much. Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw. Check out the report, Social Justice SOS. It's available from the website of the African American Policy Forum, and we'll also put a link on our website. It's great talking with you as always. As Professor Crenshaw mentioned, the African American Policy Forum and Say Her Name took part in the massive March on Washington of Women this January, the day after Donald Trump's inauguration. Alex Shine captured some of it on video. Take a look.
For so long, we as women were not allowed to have anything to do with battle, protecting our communities, protecting our country. We didn't have a voice. I refuse. I refuse as a woman. I refuse as a black woman. I refuse as a human to shut up any longer. I'm not just a soldier for India Beatty. I'm a soldier for every one of our children that have been unjustifiably taken away from us. They see her face and they know her name, and I'm going to ensure that they remember her name.
I feel that me being there is also uplifting the spirit of my daughter, because she was a revolutionist, because she was a warrior woman, and we're warrior women.
Going to that march and walking with all my sisters, thousands and thousands of my sisters, even in death, I will be a part of history.
I worry that many people don't really understand that this is not a game, that things can happen in 6 months, 6 weeks, that took 60 years to put together. And there's this inherent trust in our democratic process so much that now that it's unraveling, people think it's still magically going to protect us. So one has to put one's body where one's politics are. One has to put one's soul into the demand for a life that is sustained by our government, not destroyed by our government. We're the majority of this country, and it's important for us to have this march to remind people of that. It's important that we lift up all of the issues that we're demanding. One is the end to police violence against women of color. Is anyone with us on that?
You have a voice, you have, a body, use it. Let them see that you actually care. I'm not from here, I flew here, so that means I'm actually making, the distance, I'm going the mileage to, speak up for what I believe in.
AAPF people.
AAPF people.
Follow the 1 billion rising sign.
Follow the 1 billion rising sign.
Rise against the predator.
Rise against the predator.
Stay tight.
Stay tight.
All right. Stay tight. All right.
My name is Frances Garrett. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. I came down for the march, and I'm 73 years old. I have been protesting and been an advocate for years. I'm here for the rights of my daughter who was killed by the Phoenix Police Department and other mothers who are here fighting for the rights for their loved ones who have been murdered by the hands of the police.
It's great for me to lift my voice in a space like this where there's so many different types of people, to remind people of my experience as a Black woman living in America, because that's a part of what comes out of me and my body and my sound. I'm just worried that an already precarious, already vulnerable position is made even more so, and what that will mean when protection is not guaranteed.
We were slaves, and they're trying to push us back. That ain't gonna happen. It's not gonna happen, because we as women, we built this country. My biggest fear would be not to march. My fear would be realizing that I didn't put my all to something that's right, that's something that we was born into a right of having. How could I not? How could I not?
Intersectional feminism is about power, not people, says Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw. While visibility is an improvement over invisibility for a lot of excluded people and groups, understanding is what people really want. Understanding that is not always well reflected in observation of Women's History Month. Now, don't get me wrong, some people and institutions make the most of Women's History Month, that's March, just as they do Black or LGBTQ months, February and June. They run special series and feature important stories that tend to appear nowhere and at no time else. A whole lot of others, though, simply pay lip service, or worse, fundraise off special programming for a bit and then revert right back to business as usual, which is to say business and arts and politics and education that leave most of us out. It all reminds me of why I've always been resistant to all this month designating. After all, what's the message? That our schools and media and institutions of influence and power can get away without paying the slightest attention to the majority of the planet for all but just 28, 30, or 31 days a year? What about the rest of the time? That takes me back to Kim's point. Women, people of color, and LGBTQ people don't necessarily need time in the spotlight as much as they need a few centuries of remedial focus someplace else. I'm not talking about a white cis male history month. Some Donald Trump cabinet member is probably working on precisely that. Rather, a focus on power. Stories of women or people of color or LGBT people making it against the odds are nice, but taking a closer look at how those odds got stacked up that way in the first place would be better. How about a few months of focus on the workings of white capitalist colonial patriarchy? That would put the focus in the right place. I only wonder what greeting card messages the Hallmark Corporation would come up with. I'm Laura Flanders. You can write to me, tell me what you think by going to Laura, L-A-U-R-A, @lauraflanders.com, and you can find all the archives and all my commentaries going back years at our website. Check it out. You can also sign up for our free weekly podcast. Thanks for joining us.